Imagine waking up in 2026 and noticing that your groceries feel heavier in your hands. Not because the bags weigh more, but because your wallet does. The same cart, the same routine, yet the total at checkout keeps creeping upward. And nobody in Washington stands at a podium saying, yes, we raised your cost of living. They won't frame it that way. They'll call it strategic. They'll call it protecting jobs. They'll call it standing up to unfair trade. And most people will nod along because the language sounds patriotic and the mechanism feels invisible. But here's the reality you deserve to understand. Tariffs are one of the cleanest ways a government can push prices up without passing a law that says sales tax increase and without sending you a bill that says inflation surcharge. The price hike arrives disguised as the new normal. It arrives in the background noise of daily life. So you blame your supermarket, your landlord, your local store, your bad luck, or the economy. While the policy lever that nudged the whole price structure upward stays conveniently off stage. I'm going to walk you through how that works, calmly, step by step, because if you understand the game, you stop being surprised by the score. And near the end, I'm going to give you the one idea that ties everything together. The reason tariffs are not just about trade, but about how power manages perception. If you stay with me until the final minutes, you'll see why prices can rise without anyone admitting it, and why the loudest debate is almost never about what you're actually paying for. Let's start with the simplest definition, because the simplest definitions are often the most dangerous when politicians decorate them with fancy words. A tariff is a tax placed on imported goods. That's it, a tax. Not a moral stance, not a press release. A tax that is collected at the border. And because it's collected far away from your checkout counter, it feels like somebody else's problem. That psychological distance is the entire trick. When a tariff is imposed, the importer pays it to customs. The importer is usually not a household. It's a company, a distributor, a manufacturer, a retailer, an entity with spreadsheets, accounting teams, margins to protect, and shareholders to answer to. So what happens next is not mysterious. It's arithmetic. If you're a company and your input costs rise, you have four options. You can absorb the cost and accept lower profits. You can negotiate the foreign supplier down. You can shift the supply chain to another country. Or you can pass some or most of the cost onward through higher prices. In the real world, companies do a mix of all four, depending on how competitive the market is, how easily they can switch suppliers, how urgent the inputs are, and how much pricing power they have. Now, here's the detail that changes everything. Passing it on doesn't happen like a light switch. It happens like a slow leak. You won't see a price tag jump overnight in every category. You'll see a sequence. The first wave is usually on items that are easy to reprice quickly. Consumer goods with frequent restocking, products with predictable demand, categories where retailers can blame global costs, and move on. The second wave is quieter. Components and intermediate goods that don't show up on your receipt as tariff. They show up as new packaging, updated model, supply constraints, shipping changes, or manufacturing adjustments. But the cost is real, and it migrates. And the migration is what most people miss. Tariffs don't just tax finished goods, they often tax parts, and parts are the bloodstream of modern economies. A modern product is rarely made in one place. It's assembled, it's composed. It's a mosaic of components that move across borders multiple times before becoming the thing you buy. So a tariff placed on an input can inflate the price of domestic production as well. That means tariffs can raise prices even when the final product has a Made in USA label, because the steel, the chemicals, the electronics, the specialized machinery, or the subcomponents are global. This is where the political messaging becomes almost theatrical. You'll hear, we're taxing them. You'll hear, foreign countries will pay. You'll hear, this will bring manufacturing back. But the immediate mechanical truth is, the first payer is typically the importer, and the importer is typically domestic. Research on prior tariff rounds has repeatedly found that the cost increase shows up quickly in import prices faced by U.S. buyers with substantial pass-through. Even when the long-run outcomes shift supply chains, the short-run impact lands right where you live, on prices and margins. And Washington can look you in the eye and say, we didn't raise your taxes, because technically they didn't raise your income tax rate. They raised a different kind of tax, one that hides inside prices. Now let's talk about why 2026 is a particularly sensitive year for this dynamic. It's not because tariffs are new, they are ancient. What's new is the environment they would land in. A post-inflation world where households are already exhausted, where supply chains are already cautious, where geopolitical tensions already sit on top of trade routes like heavy clouds, and where policymakers have learned that the public reacts differently to different kinds of pain. Direct taxes are loud. You see them, you feel them, you resent them. Tariff-driven price increases are quiet. They get misattributed. They spread across thousands of products, so the blame dissolves into fog. That makes tariffs politically attractive. And in 2026, the political incentives for using tariffs are obvious. If Washington wants to look tough without passing a major domestic austerity program, tariffs offer a lever. If Washington wants to reward certain domestic industries or labor constituencies, tariffs offer a lever. If Washington wants bargaining chips in negotiation over technology, security, alliances, migration, supply chains, tariffs offer a lever. Tariffs are the Swiss Army knife of political signaling, but you're not watching a signal. You're paying a bill. Here's how Washington can raise your prices in 2026 without telling you, in 3 layers that stack on top of each other. First layer, the direct price effect. A tariff raises the landed cost of imported goods. That directly raises the price that wholesalers and retailers pay, which increases the pressure to raise shelf prices. The key word is pressure. In a competitive market, some firms absorb temporarily. In a concentrated market, pass-through is quicker. In either case, the tariff shifts the price distribution upward. Second layer, the substitution effect. When tariffs hit one country, companies try to shift sourcing. That sounds comforting, like water finding another path. But the alternative path is often more expensive, at least initially. New suppliers don't come with identical scale, identical logistics, identical quality control, or identical contracts. There are switching costs, testing, redesign, compliance, legal work, and time. And when thousands of firms try to shift at once, the new safe suppliers can raise their own prices because demand is flooding in. This is why tariff impacts can spread beyond the directly targeted goods. Even if your item isn't taxed, your item's substitute may be, and that changes the entire pricing landscape. Third layer, the uncertainty premium. When trade policy becomes unpredictable, businesses start pricing in risk. They carry more inventory just in case. They diversify suppliers just in case. They buy options on shipping just in case. They spend more on compliance just in case. Risk becomes a cost, and costs become prices. This is the shadow tax nobody votes on, the tax of instability. Now add a crucial detail. Tariffs can be implemented under multiple legal authorities, and that flexibility matters because it allows speed, discretion, and political timing. When tariffs can be adjusted quickly, expanded, narrowed, paused, reintroduced, businesses can't assume stability. And when businesses can't assume stability, they act conservatively. At this point, you might be thinking, fine, tariffs are taxes, but aren't they sometimes necessary? Isn't the goal to protect domestic industries? That's the classic argument, and it's not completely unserious. There are legitimate debates about strategic industries, national security, unfair trade practices, and industrial policy. But here's the problem. Even if you accept the argument, you still need to face the cost, because the cost is not paid by an abstract foreign country. It is paid in the form of higher prices, reduced variety, and reallocated resources, and the timing matters. When you impose tariffs, the costs are immediate and diffuse. The benefits, if they arrive, are delayed and concentrated. That's a political dream. Spread pain thinly so no one can point to a single culprit. Concentrate benefits so specific groups celebrate loudly. And if the price increases show up gradually, you can always say, it's complicated. You can always say, it's corporations. You can always say, it's global. You can always say, it's temporary. But in 2026, temporary is a dangerous word because households have already been trained by years of temporary narratives that never reversed. So the more plausible story is, tariffs will be sold as a remedy while operating like a hidden cost of living accelerator. Let's make it concrete, because abstraction is where policy hides. Think about your everyday goods: clothing, shoes, electronics, home appliances, tools, car parts, furniture, kitchen items. Most of these supply chains are global in some way, even if the final brand feels local. A tariff hits not just cheap imports, but also the affordable middle layer that households rely on. The tariff then becomes a regressive force. It bites harder as a share of income for people who spend most of what they earn. Now think about housing and construction. If tariffs touch steel, aluminum, lumber products, fixtures, specialized components, or machinery inputs, the cost of building rises. Even modest input inflation matters when housing supply is already constrained. You don't need tariffs to be the only cause of housing stress. You only need tariffs to add another weight on top of an already strained system. And when housing is strained, rent becomes political. That's when governments reach for more intervention, and intervention often creates more distortion. It becomes a feedback loop. Now think about energy and infrastructure. If tariffs influence equipment costs, transformers, industrial components, grid materials, specialized parts, project budgets rise. When project budgets rise, utilities and contractors pass costs into rates and fees. Those are prices too, just hidden under different names. Now think about food. Even if food itself is largely domestic, agriculture relies on imported inputs, machinery components, fertilizers, packaging, processing equipment, and sometimes ingredients. Tariffs can seep into food prices not through the tomato itself, but through the system that moves the tomato. This is why the phrase tariffs will raise prices is technically correct but emotionally incomplete. The deeper truth is, tariffs change the cost structure of an economy. And when cost structures change, prices reconfigure everywhere, including places you don't expect. Another mechanism Washington can use in 2026 is the targeted exemption theater. Policymakers can announce tariffs broadly, then create exemptions for certain categories or companies, then extend or expire those exemptions unpredictably. To the public, that looks like nuance and careful governance. To businesses, it looks like uncertainty and lobbying incentives. And lobbying incentives matter because they turn trade policy into a kind of auction. If the system rewards firms that can navigate exemptions, firms spend resources on navigating exemptions instead of lowering prices or improving products. That spending becomes overhead. Overhead becomes price. Again, a hidden cost. Now let's talk about retaliation, because tariffs are rarely one-sided. When a major economy imposes tariffs, trading partners often respond. Sometimes they target politically sensitive exports, agricultural goods, industrial products from key regions, categories that create headlines. Retaliation can reduce export demand, which hits domestic producers. Then governments try to make whole the affected sectors with subsidies or programs. That means fiscal costs. Fiscal costs mean more borrowing or reallocations. The tariff story quietly transforms into a broader policy spiral. And now we arrive at the part nobody likes to hear. Even if tariffs are presented as fighting inflation by protecting domestic supply, the short-run effect is often inflationary. A tax on imports is a tax on goods. Taxes on goods tend to raise prices. And if monetary policy is already in a delicate balancing act, trying to tame inflation without crushing growth, tariff shocks add complexity. Central banks react to inflation data. Inflation data reacts to policy. Policy reacts to politics. Your cost of living becomes the battleground between institutions that blame each other. This is where the narrative, Washington can raise your prices without telling you, becomes literally true. Because in the public conversation, the causal chain gets scrambled. You'll hear politicians say, prices are up because corporations are greedy. You'll hear others say, prices are up because foreign countries are unfair. You'll hear yet others say, prices are up because consumers are spending too much. But the tariff lever, the policy choice that mechanically increased the cost of a broad set of goods, will be treated as background noise. And if you're thinking, okay, but wouldn't the public notice if tariffs were raising prices? Not necessarily. Because price changes rarely arrive as clean labels. They arrive as product shrinkage. Same price, smaller size. They arrive as new version. They arrive as fewer discounts. They arrive as changed shipping fees. They arrive as limited availability. They arrive as more expensive alternatives replacing what used to be standard. Also, tariffs have a strange psychological advantage. They can be framed as hurting the other guy, which makes people more tolerant of the pain. If you tell someone you will pay $400 more per year, they resist. If you tell them we are standing up to them, they tolerate it until the cumulative pain becomes undeniable. That delay is politically valuable. Now let's talk about the Washington clock, because policy has timing, and timing is strategy. Tariffs can be announced, threatened, paused, negotiated, escalated, and reintroduced. Even the threat of tariffs can move prices because businesses act preemptively. They front-load imports before tariffs hit. They buy inventory earlier. They raise prices to prepare for higher costs. They alter contracts. The threat becomes cost. In 2026, if tariff policy becomes a recurring instrument, you could see a pattern. Businesses increase prices not only because tariffs exist, but because they cannot confidently plan around them. Planning failures create inefficiency, and inefficiency is paid for by consumers. So what does this mean for you, personally, beyond the headlines? It means you should stop thinking about tariffs as a foreign policy thing, and start thinking about them as a household budget variable. It means you should expect certain categories to experience persistent upward pressure, even if overall inflation appears to be cooling. It means you should be skeptical when someone tells you price increases are purely corporate behavior, purely supply chains, or purely monetary policy. In reality, it's often the combination. Monetary policy sets the climate, supply chains set the terrain, and tariffs can be the sudden storm that floods the low ground. It also means you should understand the second order effect. When prices rise in essentials, people cut discretionary spending. That hits small businesses. That can slow the economy. Then policymakers feel pressure to stimulate. Then deficits grow. Then borrowing costs matter. Then the temptation to use invisible policy tools increases. And tariffs remain attractive precisely because they are an off-budget revenue stream. They collect money at the border. They don't show up in the same emotional category as tax hikes, even though they function as a tax. Now we're getting close to the deeper truth I promised. The reason this game keeps returning. Here it is. Tariffs are not just an economic instrument. They are an instrument of narrative control. They allow policymakers to do three things at once: project strength, generate revenue, and distribute blame. Project strength, we're tough, we're defending the nation. Generate revenue, we're collecting money. Distribute blame. If prices rise, blame foreigners or corporations. It's an elegant political package. And that leads to the most important insight for 2026. The policy that sells best is often the policy that hides its cost best. You can't hide the cost of an income tax increase. People feel it on payday. You can't hide the cost of a property tax increase. People see it on their bill. But you can hide the cost of a tariff inside 1,000 price tags, scattered across a year, and wrapped in a story about security and fairness. That's why tariffs are so tempting in a climate where public trust is fragile and budgets are strained. So what should you do with this information besides feeling frustrated? First, adopt a new kind of awareness. When you see a wave of mysterious price increases in categories tied to imported inputs, don't just ask which company is greedy. Ask which cost layer changed. Ask, did trade policy shift? Ask, did compliance costs rise? You don't need to be paranoid. You need to be literate. Second, make your household more resilient to price shocks without doing anything reckless. If you rely heavily on categories with volatile supply chains, consider modest substitutions, not as a political statement, but as risk management. If you're planning large purchases, appliances, electronics, vehicle parts, timing can matter. Not because you can perfectly predict policy, but because policy uncertainty itself can create price volatility. Being flexible is power. Third, focus on what tariffs cannot tax easily: your skills, your adaptability, your relationships, your ability to earn across different channels. The most durable hedge against policy-driven price increases is not a perfect investment tip. It's a stronger income engine and a more adaptable lifestyle. Fourth, keep your thinking clean. In 2026, you will be flooded with simple villains. It's the corporations. It's the foreigners. It's your neighbor. It's your politics. Most of that is emotional manipulation. The truth is often structural. Policies change incentives, incentives change costs, and costs change prices. If you can see the structure, you stop being a pawn in the blame game. And now I'll give you the final piece, what I promised at the start, the idea that connects tariffs, prices, and power. The ultimate purpose of many economic policies is not only to change outcomes, but to change attribution, to decide who gets blamed. When prices rise because of a direct tax, the government gets blamed. When prices rise because of a tariff, the blame can be outsourced. It can be assigned to foreign countries. It can be assigned to corporations. It can be assigned to complex global forces. The policymaker gets to claim the moral high ground. We protected you, while you quietly pay more at the register. That is how Washington can raise your prices in 2026 without telling you. Not by keeping it secret. Tariffs are public, but by keeping the cost psychologically distant from the effect, by placing the tax far from your receipt, and placing the narrative close to your emotions. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. And when you can't unsee it, you start asking better questions. You stop being hypnotized by slogans. You start demanding clarity. Who pays? How much? How fast? Which categories? What are the second-order effects? What's the exit plan? Because a policy without an exit plan is rarely a strategy. It's often a habit. 2026 will likely be noisy. Headlines will be loud. Arguments will be louder. But your job is not to win the argument on social media. Your job is to protect your household from invisible costs. If you learned one thing today, let it be this. Whenever someone promises you a policy that punishes them, follow the money, not the microphone. Because in economics, the microphone is cheap, the money is real, and the bill, sooner or later, arrives at your door. usually disguised as a higher price tag. Thank you.